One of the bigger storylines in this NFL offseason has been the saga with Andre Johnson and the Houston Texans. Apparently, he's very upset with the organization. Now, part of that surely can maybe be attributed to the fact that the starting quarterback looks to be Ryan Fitzpatrick for the 2014 season. Maybe he sees that his window of opportunity in his career to potentially win a championship is narrowing very rapidly, and he doesn't feel like the Texans are a real legitimate threat to get there anytime soon. Maybe it's a money thing. To me, when you look at professional athletes and you hear about these situations where athletes are unhappy, no matter how you might feel about that athlete, no matter how much you might love them and worship them and respect them and admire them, don't kid yourself. Don't be naive about it. Money is always a factor in some way, shape, or form. And this is leading to a real interesting and compelling storyline that may very well come to a head here in the weeks to come. And that is, should the Houston Texans trade Andre Johnson? Now, to me, Andre Johnson has been one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League consistently since he was the third overall pick out of Miami, Florida in the 2003 NFL Draft. When you talk about the great lineage of players that come from the U, one of those players that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough is Andre Johnson. This guy, to me, has been the Houston Texan of Houston Texans. He is undoubtedly the face of the franchise. And I still think, even to this day, with a J.J. Watt in the fold being perhaps the best defensive player in the National Football League, you look at the Houston Texans and you first and foremost, I think, still think about Andre Johnson. You know, he's been one of those guys that's been relatively low-key, relatively buttoned down, and he was appealing to a lot of fans, similar to like a Larry Fitzgerald was, as kind of that counterculture to the Terrell Owens or the Chad Johnson type of show me, look at me type of wide receivers. But when you look at it, there are some arguments to be made for the Texans trading him. You're talking about a receiver that's 33 years old. You're talking about a receiver that probably doesn't have a whole lot of shelf life left in his career, and he may start to regress sooner rather than later. You know, in that case, maybe it's a good idea to get something for him while you still can. Get something for him while he still has some type of trade market. Maybe a contending team in the NFC or even in the AFC, wants him and would be willing to pay a little bit more in terms of draft pick and player compensation in order to get him. This is also a chance for the Texans to maybe get rid of him and save face. You saw this happen with what the Carolina Panthers did with Steve Smith and letting him go, and it seemed to catch a lot of people off guard, and it came kind of out of left field, and I think the Panthers took a little bit of a PR hit for waiving perhaps the greatest player in the history of that organization. Well, maybe the Houston Texans have the ability to kind of set the narrative and say, hey, this has been something that's been going on for a while. Andre Johnson was becoming too much to deal with. We needed to get him out of there. We did what we felt was best for the organization, and we also avoided a potential locker room distraction that could potentially bring the team down in a similar fashion to what happened in 2013 in terms of the Texans losing their last 14 games of the season. I don't think any Texans fans want to see that. So, the Texans have the ability here to spin a narrative and make this seem like something at least somewhat on the surface positive. But then on the flip side, man, you're talking about the face of the franchise, and you're talking about a player in Andre Johnson that has been there since 2003, the second year of the franchise's existence. He's played 11 seasons for the Texans. You could count on a lot of bad things from the Texans over the years, but the one thing you could always count on, by and large, was spectacular play by one of the best wide receivers in football in Andre Johnson. And it would be a shame, I think, for all parties involved to see Andre Johnson in anybody else's uniform other than a Houston Texans uniform. You're still talking about a receiver. Yes, he's going to be 33 years old this year. He's long in the tooth in terms of his NFL career, but you're talking about a receiver that's still coming off of back-to-back Pro Bowl seasons. And also, what does it mean when you trade your best wide receiver, your best player on the offensive end, arguably? You're basically, to me, telling your fan base that you could forget about the playoffs. They're not realistic. And I think you're also sending that message potentially to the locker room and saying that, hey, we're not going to make the playoffs anywhere this year, so it's okay to get rid of him. Let's look at the long term. Whether that's good or not for the organization, long term and for them overall is one thing, but from a PR standpoint, and these things are important, both within the locker room and outside of the locker room from fans and the media, it could go over like a fart in church, basically. And what you really would be able to get for an Andre Johnson in a trade, is anybody going to give you a first round pick? No. Are you going to be lucky to maybe even get a second round pick for him? Perhaps. I mean, would what you really get in a trade justify trading away the face of your franchise over the past 11 seasons? And I just don't know if it's worth it. I understand the Houston Texans maybe want to sit here and say, we don't want to set a precedent of caving to players and this and that, skip and whoop de woo. And I understand that. But I ultimately hope at the end of the day that cooler heads can prevail. If Andre Johnson deep down wants more money over more years, and I think that's part of what he wants, then maybe the Houston Texans need to give it to him. Maybe they need to bite the bullet a little bit. Maybe Andre Johnson could sit there on the flip side and say, hey, you know what? It's not like Matt Schaub was ever an elite quarterback. Maybe that's part of his frustration. He's had less than stellar quarterback play throughout his career with the Texans. But maybe if I'm that great of a player and maybe if I'm that much of a Hall of Fame wide receiver, then maybe I can make the most out of this situation. Maybe I could help out Ryan Fitzpatrick and a young Tom Savage and a new head coach at Bill O'Brien. Maybe I could sit there and be a mentor to a guy like DeAndre Hopkins. You know, I just hope at the end of the day that cooler heads prevail and that they could somehow reach a mutual understanding and at least punt the ball down the road for another season. But I want to know from you, do you think the Houston Texans should trade Andre Johnson, or do you think that all parties involved should find a way to kumbaya and get along?